welcome everybody. So we've got a panel of three people tonight, and the star of the show is of course Joe Zamid-Lucia, and it's to launch or pre-launch Joe's book, The New Political Capitalism. We'll come on to Joe in a minute, but first let me introduce you to Gail Clintworth, who is the former Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever. She's got a wealth of experience across diverse sectors with business, civil society and governmental organisations all around the world. She has been described as an extraordinary business executive, sustainability thought leader and inspired leader. So thank you for joining us,
It's nice,
Gail.
thank you.
And Vince Cable, Sir Vince Cable, he's been an MP, he was leader of the Lib Dems, he was Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills and President of the Board of Trade. But before entering the hothouse of the political world, Vince worked in industry and is currently a professor in practice at the LSE, visiting professor at Nottingham University and at St Mary's. And long before Ed Balls hit the dance floor, Vince was twirling. He's a very, very experienced and successful ballroom dancer. Joe, many of you will know, he's a founder of Radix and has extensive experience in the worlds of both business and politics. Originally trained as a physician at the University of London, he then went into an executive career in multinational industry before founding a management consulting business. He's a regular commentator on business and politics in the media. So welcome all. Just on the sort of housekeeping thing, because I really don't want to have a Jackie Weaver moment. If you've got something that you want to say or a question you want to raise, probably the chat app thing is the best way to do it, but don't make it too long because I can't read and talk to people at the same time. If you want to ask your own question, just indicate somehow or other. Otherwise, I'll ask it for you and try and come back to you so we can get as many people in as possible. We'll tell you a bit more about how you can get hold of the book as well, which is published by Bloomsbury and is available on Amazon. So, Joe, let me first of all start with one of your introductory paragraphs. You say business and politics are inseparable. The relationship is as complex as it is dynamic, and is becoming ever more relevant to sustainable business success. The world is changing fast. The shape and nature of that change will have the characteristics of politics, not business. Volatile, emotional, complex, multi-directional and multi-linear, not comfortably linear. Now, that might be uncomfortable for business people to hear that. They may feel that politics should change or stay off their turf. What do you think?
Well, we've lived through an era where business people took the view that they should be apolitical, that their job is to deliver shareholder value, and that political considerations should be kept to the side as much as possible. I think, we all remember Tony Blair. Well, I don't know if we all remember Tony Blair, but we all remember Tony Blair saying as much, saying, business should get on with the business of making money and leave other considerations, social and political consideration, to others, meaning himself. But increasingly, of course, first of all, this has never been the case. Business and politics have always interacted one way or the other. But today we're seeing that interaction becoming even more pronounced. Business leaders are expected to have views and to do something about, be it climate change, other environmental damage, social issues, a myriad of things that could be that are in fact political. So there's no way that business can avoid being political. And I think we have John Kay here. As John put it in one of his articles, business is part of our social fabric and has an impact on our societies which goes well beyond delivering shareholder value. So the idea that business ever was, can ever be apolitical, just doesn't hold water.
Well, we'll hopefully perhaps hear from John later on if he feels like he'd like to add to this. But there is a tribal element to this, Joe, isn't there? Business sees politics as irrelevant and slightly grubby. Politicians, as you've just said about Tony Blair, have a more complex relationship with business. And I'm not going to quote the Prime Minister of what he said about business because we're not past the watershed in anybody's household at the moment. But there is that sort of element of that, one is better than the other. And most business people who get into politics are usually positioned as outsiders, ready to disrupt, arguably better managers. That doesn't make them good leaders. It doesn't make them good in the political sphere.
Well, rather than tribal, I would say there are significant cultural differences. Business people are used, business is essentially a dictatorship. The CEO says jump and people say how high. And business people want to get from place A to place B, and they draw a straight line and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. And they try to find the most efficient way of doing that. Politics is much messier. It's a question of trying to balance a coalition, trying to balance multiple, often conflicting interests, and trying to move forward in a way that cajoles the population and leads the population to follow you. So it's quite a different culture being in business, being a CEO, or being a prime minister. The fact that business people and political people see the world in a different way is pretty understandable, because the culture within which they operate is fundamentally different.
Vince, let me bring you in here. If you could put your microphone on, please, unmute yourself. I mean, you've been in both camps at very senior level. What's your experience of interaction between the two camps, if you like, the two tribes, the two worlds of politics and business?
Yes, well, I never saw it in terms of tribes. I think Joe's done a wonderful job in trying to see the wood through the very complex forest of different types of trees here. But I think I should start by, setting out, as somebody who actually was the business secretary, what dealing with business actually was. And there was no such thing. There were, quite apart from the myriad of different companies, often from different countries with very different cultures, Japanese, Chinese, Indian, American, French, different corporate cultures. I was dealing on a daily basis with the CBI, the voice of big business. It also included banks. A lot of people wouldn't regard as business. The Federation of Small Business, a very different animal, very needy. Looking to politicians like me to support them against big business. Chambers of Commerce, Institute of Directors, MAID, the manufacturers with a belief in manufacturing, quite different from the service sector. The Retail Consortium, again, with a different culture. And putting them all in one box is called business, I find quite difficult to get my head around. My relationship, and what I tried to create, was cooperative with the business sector. But of course, there were some businesses who see us as adversaries, others who would seek to use us. There were some businesses who were in the rent-seeking business, natural monopolies, people who are in property development, land appreciation business, others who were highly competitive entrepreneurs and innovating. So, Joe's done a great job in simplifying. My first reaction is to try and broaden it out and recognize that we are dealing with very complex structures, different kinds of organization with different motivations. My experience overall was pretty positive, I have to say.
But very briefly, Vince, because I want to bring Gail in, do you think that's because you had got experience of business and industry before you went into politics?
Partly. So I started off with a kind of minimum level of credibility, but actually I wasn't an entrepreneur. I was in one of the biggest companies in the world and doing strategy. And say that isn't business. No, but it did help. But if I just list you some of the businesses who were in and out of my department, you get a flavor of politics, business interaction. I had Michael Heseltine, who had an office. He was absolutely brilliant, wonderful businessman, great politician. I also had Philip Green in trying to tell me how to do my job, and if only the business department was organized like Topshop, the country would be in a much better place, he told me. So, you know, the experience of interacting with individual businessmen, some of whom, you know, the Michael Heseltines were, you know, transported into politics, vision and competence and complicated systems, the kind of things you do in good companies, and were a great asset, and others like Philip Green, who were, you know, the other end of the pole.
So yeah, a polite way of putting it.
Business was helpful, but not essential.
So, Gail, if I can bring you in, I mean, you have worked with government, and obviously because you've been with big business globally as well, you're working with and alongside government and all the structures and all the things that Vince and Joe have just talked about. Governments have called on business people, and there have been successes, most notably Kate Bingham with the vaccine rollout, but, you know, let's not even talk about Dido Harding. Others have been brought in to shape the Whitehall or White House tree, but it doesn't very often happen in reverse. Do you think there is a resistance to change in built-in business at a senior level?
Thanks, Joe. So, you know, I guess on both tribes, which I agree with Vince, I don't see as two different kind of tribes. I see it as different players in the economy. I think on both sides is this view that, you know, only I can do my job well. So I think there is a set of perhaps business arrogance that says, well, if you haven't run a business, you don't know what to do. In some ways, that's true, right? So it's the same as moving from one sector to another within businesses. You know, it's not obvious that with most of my background being in fast-moving consumer goods and financials, that I'll be really good at running Shell, right? So I think, you know, we shouldn't simplify it too much. That being said, you know, one of the thoughts I had on reading Joe's book again is what's common. And, you know, unfortunately, I don't think we have enough of that discussion, right? So what's common? Well, what's common is the economy. What's common is that citizens are also customers and consumers, right? What's common is that ideally everyone is looking for, presumably, greater prosperity. And unfortunately, we don't often take ourselves a step back and say, well, if this is common, what is the role of each of us? And particularly now when we talk about, you know, the importance of systemic change to address some of the big challenges in our world, right? What is the role of each player? So is business arrogant and not wanting to change and accept guidance from government? Yes, I think that's true. I think it's true the other way around. But actually, if we see one another as players within a system, I think that's a healthy debate that can be had.
So Joe, that's interesting points that both Gail and Vince have made. But I suppose the question is, it comes down to leadership, doesn't it? And that is not the same as management. You know, you can think of inspirational politicians. You can also think of inspirational business people, you know, Anita Roddick, for instance, Richard Branson, James Dyson, Mark Zuckerberg, and so on and so forth. How do you get the best out of both? Because business by its very nature is very hierarchical. You know, you get to be the boss if you set up the company. Otherwise, you have to work your way up or come in at a senior level. Politicians, it's a bit more hit and miss, as we know. But how do you get that good leadership where it works together, as Gail's just said, you know, where there's more in common than there is a difference? Are you there, Joe? We seem to have lost Joe. Hello, Joe. You're on mute.
There you go. How many times have we heard it in the last 2 years? You're on mute.
Yeah. How many times have we wished we'd heard it for some people?
Yeah, I mean, you know, both Gail and Vince are right, of course. There's no monolithic thing known as business. And, you know, there are people, and every system is hierarchical. You know, you can't have any big organizational system that is not to some extent hierarchical. So that is a kind of a given. I think it's a question of how people see their role in our society. And, you know, if business people and businesses see their role as being there to help create a better society, and what constitutes a better society, of course, is a political question. But if business sees itself as being a player in creating a better society, then the objectives of business and politics become much more aligned. If some business people see their role much more narrowly as delivering financial value to shareholders, then the opportunity for seeing the world differently and the opportunity for not being able to build this collaborative structures and these collaborative interactions between business and government increases. So the question is, what is the role of business in our society? And what I argue is that business, having a lot of power in society and therefore a lot of responsibility, that the role of business, just like the role of civil society, the role of politics, the role of many others, is to participate in the process of creating a better society, whether we define that as prosperity or however we define that. Business has a role to play, an important role to play in creating a better society. And that is what politicians and what politics is about. So it should be possible and reasonable, though it's not necessarily easy, to see that everybody should be trying to work towards the same objectives.
But of course, there will be people who will take a cynical view. And in fact, there was a column in the Daily Mail today, and the headline was "Get Woke, Go Broke." From M&M sweets to Nike trainers, firms are turning famous brands into insufferably preachy social justice warriors. And it talks about Unilever. Well, I want to come to you, Gail, because you used to work for Unilever, and we did have a brief email exchange about this. But this is the sort of thing that, you know, where businesses may be trying to do the right thing, whether it's in response to customers or, you know, investors looking for greater value beyond the financial, if they're going to be slammed and they see their share price go down, how do they deal with that? Gail?
Yeah. Of course, you know, I've been delighted by all of this ding-donging in the media about like woke capitalism, which of course is an oxymoron in itself. So first of all, just looking at those articles, right? First of all, I'm delighted that they're coming out in the media because it's great that you have this debate. I think there are two issues. The first is, we really have a problem at the moment, and Rory, please excuse me for using kind of the advertising industry as part of the problem, in that marketers and advertisers have grabbed hold of the business role in society. And so, it's, you know, unfortunately, this is being recorded, but, you know, at the end of the day, you can't put lipstick on a pig, right? So I have worried, and I did worry when I was with Unilever and in financial services, that the more we allow the glitter to take over what the actual gift should be, the more we are going to expose ourselves to criticism. So that's the first thing. I think there really is, I mean, you know, a green M&M taking on a social cause, big question about whether it's a good idea or not, question. Right. Secondly, I think these sorts of criticisms about sustainability being the cause for business poor performance is ridiculous, to be honest. So, you know, I could count, and if I was so inclined, I would, a lot of the arguments being used here. So if you look at a huge amount of growth that is being driven by companies around the world, there are companies that are delivering goods that are meeting social needs that are very often about improving society. So, you know, the idea that if you think about your role as being in service of, you're going to lose money is narrow in thinking. The third point is that, you know, I've just been looking at some interesting survey results from GlobeScan, which I happen to chair, and they do all of this amazing work at looking at consumer and customer perspectives. And, you know, consumers like woke in many parts of the world. So, you know, this idea that the investor community comes in and says, look, your performance is so, why is it low? You know, why is your performance bad? Oh, it's bad because you've suddenly gone after kind of being a decent person in the world. That's actually not true. So I think we need to take even the criticism with a pinch of salt.
Well, it is the Daily Mail, obviously, and, you know, the war on work. But Vince, I mean, how far can government, if indeed government should get involved in pushing businesses to be more responsible, if you like, whether it's about the food industry putting in less sugar and salt, whether it's, you know, dealing with supermarkets and really simple things like, you know, putting sweets on display where kids are going to nag their parents to get them. I mean, how far can business go on regulation to set an example or to push businesses who might otherwise be reluctant until consumers start screaming?
Yes, you can nudge, you know, through regulation or tax incentives. But I think there's a bigger problem. I mean, if I can step back a bit, I mean, I grew up in the city of York. The two big companies were Rantries and Terry's, the Quaker companies, who cared passionately about consumers and workers and the local community. And they, you know, they succumbed, basically. Rantries is now a small branch of Nestle. When I came into government, I mean, the first big issue I had to deal with was the after effect of the takeover of Cadbury by Kraft. And I was too late by the time I got there. Peter Mandelson tried to do something about it. The question is, what role for government? And there were a few things we could do to make shareholding more long-term, which we did, you know, tinkered with the takeover panel rules and things of that kind, but the scope was limited. The thing really came to a head when I was in government with the potential takeover of AstraZeneca by Pfizer, because Pfizer had a 5-year horizon for drug development and AstraZeneca had a 10-year plus. And we wanted to stop Pfizer, and we did actually by bullying them and, you know, making them feel thoroughly unwelcome. And it worked, working sort of hand in glove with the AstraZeneca directors, and we saw them off. But actually, the role of government in these circumstances is quite limited. I'll just take one other example. I did launch a big campaign to get more women on boards. And I think 99 out of 100 of the top 100 companies were very cooperative, very polite, did something. Actually, all of them got women on board with one exception. And that was Mr. Blazenberg at Glencore, who just thought the whole thing was a joke. Only came to see me and told me it was a joke, and he wasn't going to do anything about it. Why should he put women on board if he hasn't got an able woman in mining? He wasn't going to put them on his board, and walked away. And of course, Glencore remain a phenomenally successful company, you know, rather more successful than most of the companies in his sector. So, you know, I would love to see the caring company and see it progress and see the instruments of government's been used, but we're fighting against a tide very often. I don't totally share Joe's belief that the sentiment in the market has shifted away from shareholder value. I mean, it may have in some sectors, but in most it hasn't, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Vince. Just a reminder, if you want to join in the conversation, please put your questions up on the chat thing. So Andy Sellers, I can't see you, but no, I can't. But if you want to ask your own question, please do. I can ask it for you. Actually, why don't I ask the question, then we'll find out where. Oh, there you are. Right, turn your microphone on. Right,
Thank you,
off
Jo.
you go, Andy.
And thank you for the opportunity to address our illuminated panel. So Andy Sellers from a Catapult, actually a research and technology organisation that Savin set up when he was in government. So it's a great honour. So quite a lot of the companies that we deal with actually have, for profit maximisation reasons, have offshored some of their responsibilities. So we have very good legislation and regulations in the UK, but it's not necessarily a level playing field. And this is kind of why a lot of the manufacturing has, we import a lot of manufacturing from China, where they have different standards. You know, there's less pollution, there's less environmental standards. And I guess my question here is just about, if you're running a business, you're looking at your P&L accounts, you've got your shareholders to maintain, you want to keep you do have a societal element, but the fundamental thing is you want to keep your business profitable and you want to maintain your sustainability in the marketplace, all other things being equal. So my question just really is, are businesses, to what extent are they incentivized to look at the broader societal and environmental aspects?
Jo, do you want to come back to Andy's question? Thank you, Andy.
So to pick up on Vince and Vince's comment about whether the shareholder value mentality is gone. Of course, it's not gone, and it won't be gone. But we are in a transitional period. So to pick up on Andy's question, of course, the multinational model behaves in exactly the way that you describe. Where is the lowest regulation? Where are the lowest costs? Where are the lowest labor costs? And that's been traditionally the multinational model, which has been given rocket boosters by globalization and the fact that things can move around so easily. So this is the kind of the soft underbelly or the downside of the globalized world that we have lionized for so long. And in terms of change, I think we're in a period of change, and change takes a long time. So this is a multi-decade process. But these days, it's not just government. There's a lot of civil society pressure. There's a lot of other pressures on businesses not to export their externalities, essentially, not to export their carbon emissions to China or Vietnam, because we know that the effects of that come back to bite us. So I think the world has changed in the sense that the pressures on business are coming from multiple sides now, plus the transparency that we have today with social media, with investigative journalism, with all this other stuff, is miles different from what it was 10, 20, 25 years ago. So I think what you describe is true, but it's changing. It'll change slowly. It'll change in a very haphazard, chaotic manner. But the pressures are all in the same direction.
In the book, Jo, you say that, just drawing on the whole thing about external pressures and particularly globalization, but you say we've belatedly recognized that an excess of globalized thinking has fractured the concept of a political economy, while political legitimacy remains primarily embedded in the nation state or subnational units. Economics and finance have become transnational, putting them beyond democratic accountability. And that's a really key point, isn't it, to this?
It is, and it's, in my view, very problematic, because you can't have a society where commercial and economic considerations are dissociated from the political framework. That is a recipe for disaster. But that's essentially where the multinational model, or some go further and call it the transnational model, not even recognizing multinational, has fractured that link between the polity, the political structures, and the economic and commercial structures. But I think we're moving back. I think we're recognizing that this is problematic, and trying to do something about it. Now, what to do about it, of course, is not an easy question to answer. How long it'll take to do something about it is also unknown. And whether we can do something about it is also another question. But I think the problem has been recognized, and it's problematic. And there's been a lot of literature in the past, and I can't remember his name, the guy from Harvard, who kind of takes the view that globalization and democracy are essentially incompatible, that the more you give on one, the more you undermine the other. Now, that's a view, and some people will disagree with it, but it is an issue because politics still remains essentially national or subnational, European Union apart, that's trying to move in that direction. But even that is a bloc that's different from China, that's different from the US. So reinventing or rediscovering the concept of a political economy, I think, is very important.
Okay, I'm just going to read out a couple of questions quickly. You can always put your hand up, by the way, if your virtual hand, if you want to join in. John Goddard is asking, do we need to distinguish between politics and government civil service, especially as regulator and investor? And Julian Ranger makes the point that politics and business often move at different speeds. This often causes tensions and issues. Can I come to you, Vince, on that, and then to Gail, because you've both got experiences of governments globally and in the UK. So Vince, if you'd like to go first.
Well, first of all, there are differences in time horizons. I think Joe says in his book that business gets very frustrated by the short terms of politics, and he's quite right. This is very often the case. If you're a big manufacturing company, then governments that are operating on a 3 or 5 year time horizon is very frustrating. But of course, there are many aspects of business that are also fairly short term. I mean, even private equity, which is amongst the longer term type of private investors, will operate on a 5 year time span. And of course, many asset managers are in very, very short term. So it's not a fundamental difference, I think, timing between business and politics. It varies. I think what he said a few moments ago about the difference between globalizing business and national politics is absolutely fundamental. I mean, that is the big conflict that's going on at the moment. And of course, the Chinese, amongst others, recognize that, which is why President Xi has launched his common prosperity. You can be a billionaire providing you behave according to the edicts of the local Communist Party. And I think what's happening in our own countries is that we're moving away from internationally integrated businesses to national champions, all kinds of state interventions that have a national focus. I mean, Joe is right that you can't have economics and politics pulling in fundamentally different directions. And the way it's happening is you're getting the nationalization of what used to be international business.
Gail, you're nodding and shaking your head. I don't know whether you're
nodding and shaking.
Yeah.
So look, first of all, just let's talk about time differences. Yes, right. I think for business, the biggest frustration is flip-flopping. Right. So, if you're trying to make a 20-year investment, and let me just talk diesel cars for a moment, and then everyone will know what I'm talking about, right? So, 1 minute, this is the way we're going. Oops, no, we're going that way. And actually, we've set up factories all around the world to do something. So I think that is an issue. But then it's also an issue with business being short term. So that's on the time. On the globalization multinationals, this is an unsolved issue of our time, and it is major, right? So this is where I begin to understand where local politicians come from, right? It just cannot be right that we have globalized industries where, and I'll just use something I'm very familiar with, right? So tea. So, I buy a box of tea in Tesco and I pay, let's say, £2 for it. The value add for that tea, where does it come from? right? I mean, at the end of the day, you're taking resources from one place. And I mean, I know the tea process quite well, right? You're kind of crushing it up, fermenting it, for want of a better word, and then putting it in a tea bag, in a box. And right, the country who has all the resources, how much do you think they get out of that £2 box? Right? Well, the last work I did, we were saying that country probably gets 10p. And in fact, the poor people that are breaking their backs, picking the tea leaves, get like half a p. The rest of the money obviously goes to everything along the supply chain. And then finally, you know, the big money is where we sell it on and where we market it. And that's, of course, where also the tax gets paid. Now, if I were, and I am in many cases, a country that has the resource, right, I would be saying, sorry, hang on, just because you happen to be here first, right, and you happen to build the factories and you happen to be running the global economic system, right, why do my people have to live in squalor? And your people become the very wealthy, you know, industrialists. And of course, this is a lot to do with not only knowledge development, but the political economy. Now take that forward to what's happening with the service economy, what's happening with information technology. Where is the big money being made now? And how can you possibly put any form of national boundary around where value gets created in AI? Where does value get created in tech? So are we eventually, and excuse me, Joe, because I don't want to veer this off of the political economy agenda, but, you know, are we eventually, let's take it really far forward, are we eventually going to be running an economy from Mars? And the rest of us will all be workers making the semiconductors, but all the value will be happening in some, you know, meta universe where individuals that should be benefiting in the economy aren't. You know, so there's some very interesting questions, and Joe starts posing them in his book, which is why I love the book so much.
Okay, and that's a perfect way to plug the book, which is published by Bloomsbury and available on Amazon, and the link is there. And don't forget the hashtag, which is New Political Capitalism. Now, John Kay, you had your hand up. Would you like to come in, turn your microphone off? And then just as a warning, I'm coming briefly to John Goddard and Ashok after John Kay.
Yep, I'm responding, Joe, to your invitation at the beginning to intervene. You quoted, or Joe did, the remark about business operating within a social context. And of course it does, and everyone understands that. What I believe is two things. One is we've, over the last 40, 50 years, been the victim of a caricature of what business is, which is, as it were, being inflamed by business itself. It's the idea that Joe described a hierarchy in business in which the CEO says jump and everyone in the business jumps, asks how high. To my mind, successful business isn't really like that, and it wouldn't be successful if it were like that. You know, business is actually itself a complex social organization. I like the idea because I take the point that Joe made that all activities actually require some kind of hierarchy. But my idea of a successful hierarchy and my picture of successful business is what Blair and Stout have called a mediating hierarchy. It's one in which people join the business, signing up to some kind of process. And the role of the leader in that business is not to make decisions and tell everyone what to do. It's to understand what the decisions are, when they're made, ratify them, and help secure systems in which people behave in accordance with them. In that way, I don't think the nature of business is fundamentally different from the nature of any other organizational activity in the economy. And we've, I think, misrepresented, and business itself in the shareholder value era has encouraged that misrepresentation. The second point I want to make is that with business operating in a social framework, we have to think about what the relative roles, both of different businesses and of different and of business and politics actually are. And I think it's a mistake to say that we should all be contributing to some understood conception of the public good. Actually, we all have different roles in that, in achieving that. And the National Gallery has one role, Oxford University has another, and M&Ms have another role. And all the appropriate task for all of these is to perform these roles well. Now that means, to my mind, that it's not for M&Ms to take a view on political issues. If I take the two classic US cases of the last decade, the Citizens United, in which a group of business people decided they didn't like Hillary Clinton very much, and there's Hobby Lobby, in which a particular business decided they didn't like the fact that Obamacare required them to offer contraceptive cover and the like to their employees. And both these cases, I think, regrettably, the Supreme Court actually sided with the right of the corporation to take political stances. I think if we really want to encourage business to take political stances, we need to ask ourselves what these political stances are going to be. They're going to be political stances, essentially, of executives, and probably eccentric executives, and a lot of them, like the Koch brothers, we will not much like what these political stances are. It's not a tenable position for us to say it's great when business takes up political positions we agree with, and inappropriate for them to take up political positions that we disagree with. But we're in danger of doing precisely that. I think the job of, I rather agree with some of the sentiment of the Daily Mail article which you describe, that we shouldn't have woke corporations. M&M's job is to make candy well. And that is essentially it. An oil company's job is to do the much more complex job of being an oil company well. And that takes one back to Joe's remark about the job of the politician being to manage a whole variety of conflicting and complex pressures. I think that that's the job of the corporate executive as well. And it's actually the reality of the job of the corporate executive. And the idea that the corporate executive is there to maximize value for shareholders and to tell everyone what to do to achieve that aim is a caricature of business that bears no relation to the reality of business conducted successfully.
Thank you very much, John. I'm very aware of time pressure, so we've got quite a lot of questions and points. So, Ashok, are you there? Are you ready to ask your question?
Sure, yes, I am.
If you could keep it brief, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I really like the way, John, you characterized the role of business. And I've always found when I got to run a business, I was surprised how little power I actually had. And that may be in common with politicians, but that may say more about me than the business. My question, the big thing I've found is the difference between politics and business is the different currencies they operate in. Business works in money, politics works in votes. And when that can operate in a sort of negative back-scratching way, exploitative way, or in a way where they both operate to serve people, individuals. And I'm just interested in Joe and the panel's views on whether what it takes to achieve the positive consumer-focused way. And just one final point. What I see in business these days is a business leaders feeling the need to provide a moral compass where politics is failing to do so.
Okay, that's great. Hold the thought, panel, please, because I just want to bring in John Goddard briefly because his question ties into this. So John, if you could keep your question brief, please. Microphone on.
Mute, unmute. Okay, hi. I've talked a lot with Joe about, I suppose, what I would call the politics of place. Politicians represent places. We have an electoral system which is place-based, and the issue of how business relates to place is changing. I mean, there's less and less sunk investment and commitment to place, or it's an exploitative situation because you want to take advantage of location. So there is a deep tension between politics as through the representative system and business. And then it goes into issues of governance. And so all the stuff that's going on at the moment now about Red Wall constituency and business, I think is a big question. Well, then my question is about politics and place and business.
Okay, right. Well, I think you're going to get the answer because Gail has already responded on the chat thing. But Gail, I'm going to come to you first to really say what you've said on there. And then I'm coming to you, Vince.
Yeah, Grant, I really love the point, John, because one, I mean, there's some great writing on this around the problems that have been created in society because place, whether it be local community, local representation or local business, has just been left out of this grand game that we're all playing, which is around monopoly. We think we're playing monopoly on a board, right? When actually people live in places.
Absolutely.
Right. And so, you know, what we see happening, whether it's the divide between the North and the South, whether it's climate impacts, getting people moving, you know, whether it's a refugee crisis, so much of this, and refugee crisis, I'm not suggesting only between nations, I'm saying, you know, within nations, not between nations, is such a big issue. And we haven't sorted out how to do it. And one of the reasons we haven't sorted out to do it, and I'm going to, this is a really important point, no one wants to give up anything, right?
Yep.
So you've got these a couple of millionaires who are saying like, tax us more. Well, you know, God bless them. I'm sure they're not invited to too many clubs right now. But it's the same with London versus Birmingham, right? And it's the same with the UK. It's the same with, you know, the West to some extent versus the rest, right? So if we are talking about a society of 10 billion people, right? And we know that we need to have a certain level of prosperity and a certain level of health and a certain level in order for us to retain global stability. You know, one, I guess, would have to argue that some of what we're doing in business and some of what we're doing in politics, and actually in many cases, we are equally to blame for this, is not working. And so, John, I agree with you.
Okay, Vince, if you'd like to perhaps address Ashok's point, which was the key difference between business, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the difference between business and politics is the different currencies they operate in, money or votes. If you'd like to deal with that briefly. And then Ishmael, if you could be ready to have your question as well. Vince.
Well, it is, of course, true, but they can be reconciled. I mean, the way I try to reconcile it is that you look at societies where, you know, you get quality of life, public satisfaction indicators are the highest. And so you look at Nordic countries or Canada or New Zealand, where the philosophy is business should do what business does well in competitive markets, in open competitive markets. And politics should concentrate on delivering good public goods, ensuring that there's a basic standard of fairness, equality of opportunity. And some countries do this well and some don't. And, you know, Britain is clearly struggling to get the balance right. The United States, you know, highly dysfunctional. But I think we have we have enough examples around about how you can get a good synthesis of the creativity of business and the, politics working well. I mean, it does happen.
Thank you. Julian, I'm sorry, you've had your hand up for ages, but you were on my second page, so I couldn't see you, but colleagues have pointed you out. So Julian and then Ishmael, please.
Thank you. I asked the question and Vincent Gale answered it on timing, but it's interesting because they answered it completely the other way than I was thinking. So they addressed businesses being long time scale and politics short, but I'm actually looking at it from the other perspective, that business is short and politics is long, especially in tech, which moves very fast, and politics doesn't catch up, even if it's in the desired direction. And that's causing huge tensions. I mean, say companies like mine, we just tend to sort of ignore it because we have to get on. And I just wondered what the panel's thoughts were about the fact that things do move at such a pace, and can politics ever keep up with that pace? Because you need that technical, the innovation understanding, and systems are in government too slow to keep up because they want to consider everything. So that's the thought.
Thank you, Julian. Before I come to you, Ishmael, can I come back to you, Joe? Because actually this is a point that you make in the book in relation particularly to the internet. And you say the conflicts surrounding internet governance are the new spaces where political and economic power are unfolding. But it's also about where these tensions and the different speeds at which things work, because politics has been incredibly slow to even imagine what the internet and what social media can do. So Joe, have you got any thoughts of that before I go to Ishmael?
Yes, politics is inevitably slow, and there's nothing I think that we can do about that. But there are opportunities to try and get ahead of the game rather than be asleep at the wheel. So let's give one specific example. We know that social media ran away essentially on a runway, and it's difficult to catch up in regulatory terms and in structuring that market now that it's gone so far. But now all the talk is about the metaverse. And, we've seen some articles recently of people going into the metaverse and being sexually harassed and, aggressively being approached and all this sort of thing. Well, we know that this is going to happen. So there is an opportunity for regulators to try and get ahead of that game before it actually becomes a reality, rather than wait for it to happen and then it's impossible to regulate afterwards. So I think there are opportunities to get ahead of the game. But again, getting back to our previous conversation, I don't think this can be done without the collaboration of business, because business, the businesses developing this metaverse know what their vision is, know which way they're going to go, and they should be seeking, in my view, to collaborate with the political regulatory system to co-develop this and to work towards something that is going to be useful to us socially rather than destructive. But if politics remains slow and business runs ahead of time and says, let's keep them out of this because they'll only slow us down, then, we're getting into these same problems. And politics has a difficult balance because on the one side, it wants to encourage economic prosperity. It wants to encourage commerce. It wants to encourage the development of companies and the development of innovation. But its other hat is to hold all these people and all these corporations to account. And finding that balance doesn't always work. I mean, as we saw with the Volkswagen diesel scandal, do you worry about the economy of Lower Saxony, or do you worry about what your citizens are inhaling? And how do you find that balance? So it's a natural tension. There are no easy answers, but I think if the business community and the political community could see that they have a common interest in developing in a way that helps our societies, then maybe we get more dialogue earlier, and everybody gives something, as opposed to everybody taking everything.
Which sort of brings us on to the area of public affairs, which I know is something that you've obviously been privy to or subjected to, Vince. And I know, Gail, it's an area that you've worked in. Now, public affairs in its proper, true sense is about engaging business with what's going on politically. It's not necessarily about lobbying. And I think part of the problem is that, public affairs done properly is good, in the same way as corporate social responsibility is good when it's not just a bolt on. Do you have any thoughts on that, Gail?
Yeah, so I think we confuse public affairs with public relations in the kind of selling context. So the very best public affairs people that I know of are ones who deeply understand the political agenda and are the partnership arm of a business. I mean, here I will talk about the positive experiences with Unilever, where we in fact had, and not a super cozy relationship, but we in fact had a relationships with the civil service in the UK, where we had people coming into Unilever, into public affairs, to understand what we were trying to do and help us think through and help the government think through what was necessary to drive the positive kinds of changes. So I think that's really important. What I think is a disaster, and in fact, I think there are also cultural differences in the way people think about this, because the vast majority of public affairs in companies is just seen as, I want to go and get what I can get for this business. And if I look at, I want to just go back to this thing of, what is the currency? Is the currency of business of money, or is the currency of business and versus votes? I think political influence is a common currency everywhere. So a lot of what business needs to do, it can't do as an individual institution. It needs to do as a sector. In fact, political influence across sectors is also important. And otherwise you can't get movement. And so, perhaps we need to somehow, those of us who are trying to move forward society need to do what I think Joe's tried to do in his book, and I'm not his key salesperson, by the way, but is to just step back and ask ourselves, sort of, what are we all aiming for, and what is our role in that? And I just want to make one more point, Joe, which is, I always find it so interesting to go to a simple question of where is your pension invested, and what is it doing economically? And so, when we put ourselves into very different camps, I also find it so interesting that most of the money in the world is still moving around sovereign wealth funds and government pensions. And where is that going? And what influence is it having? Which I think is something we kind of forget to ask. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Ishmael, I'm sorry, we've seemed to pass you by, even though I said I'd come to you, but actually your question relates to this. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself. Are you there, Ishmael?
Yes, I mean, very briefly, Joe, thank you.
Thank you.
Obviously, we're talking about big business, and then I had an opportunity to read Joe's book. So I think he primarily gives reference from the big business, which is different than, as Vince said, totality of business. And what we see currently is increasing power of big business. Even IMF has admitted that, and then sees that as a danger for growth. And as Gail said, I mean, all those value creations is really to stop competition. If you cannot advertise like me on TV, then you cannot enter this market. So there's a natural tendency in business to be monopolistic. Now, they have the resources to invest in environmental, social causes. So I'm skeptical that this concern with politics and big business will further increase their power and monopolistic tendencies. So I would like to know what Joe thinks about that.
Joe, straight to you then.
Well, again, monopoly is comfortable. You can collect rents, you can make money, you don't have to worry very much. So it's kind of inevitable that people will seek that. To some extent, they try to seek it in politics too, if they can, with dominant parties in many countries that cannot be shaken. The challenge is to stop that, and that's the role of government, of holding businesses to account. Vince mentioned earlier, and this is another tension, I think, within politics. Vince mentioned earlier this renewed desire for national champions. Is this a politics? Is the desire for national champions, a politics that's going to encourage oligopoly and monopoly again, or is it? So how do you balance all these things? I think it's all very difficult. But again, I would like to come back to the pressures on business coming from many different directions. So, John made the point that if businesses take political stances, then it's just the view of a few senior executives. Well, that may have been the case, but I think that's also changing. So, Google was essentially, forced by its employees to pull out of defense contracts, costing it about $10 billion over 10 years. Microsoft was forced by its employees to pull out of contracts with the US immigration authorities because they didn't believe in the immigration policy. So again, we're getting all sorts of pressures now on executives that come from very many different directions. So, does the social responsibility thing increase monopoly? I don't think it has to, if competition policy works. But again, competition policy is a challenge because, as we've said before, we want our national champions. We want Volkswagen to be the biggest car company in the world. And therefore, and by the way, if I'm the government of Lower Saxony, I'm also a shareholder in Volkswagen. So I make money if they make money. So it's all a complex network that's very difficult to tease apart.
Vince, do you think politicians are up to the job of the huge challenge?
Well, I suppose a slightly banal answer is that, it varies a great deal. The government I worked in, I thought, we were quite good at focusing on the big picture and the longer term, but the world has changed. Now, just one thing where I think the discussion got into the wrong direction is this idea that business is rushing. This is true of kind of technology companies and fintech, but there are large chunks of the economy where big long-term decisions have to be made with long incubation periods. I mean, the company I was involved with, we were doing 30-year projects, and it would take 5 years to take a decision. I mean, it was the nature of the animal. If you're in, Rolls-Royce, you're thinking about the next generation of engines, run on hydrogen or something. And these are not things you can do in a rush. And the problem actually with time horizons is that it's very often the markets that are just too short term. And one of the best pieces of work that was done in my period of government was actually by John Kay and a couple of collaborators who are looking at the short-termism issue within equity markets. So I think, the idea that politicians are just sort of short-term and opportunist and just too slow to deal with business, that's a caricature and actually wrong in many key sectors. If you talk about decarbonisation, you have to have a very long-term perspective and long-term decision-making.
Well, let me put the question to you then, Gail, but in reverse. Are business leaders up to it? Or not necessarily leaders, I mean influencers. you know, because that is a point, isn't it, about it's not just at the top. The employees and people in the supply chain, as well as consumers and investors, can also have a huge influence. So is business up to these challenges that Joe lays out so eloquently in the book?
Yeah, well, you know, I think it's such a broad, I mean, when you say, is politics up to it or governments up to it? I mean, it depends on who you're speaking about, right? And I'd say exactly the same thing for business. You know, I would, and maybe it's not helpful, but I would ask the question of whether, excuse this, but is humanity up for it, right? So are we, as citizens of a planet that is that has real issues, right? And I say planet, not just in the, you know, grand ecosphere of what's happening to climate change, but, you know, with all of what we're dealing with, both socially, economically, and environmentally, as well as changing constructs in what's happening around governance, what's happening around industrial sectors, or no longer industrial sectors, health, what is happening around health. Are we as humanity really up to tackle this? I'd say, you know, some people are, some people aren't. It's much like the world is. And so, you know, are there individuals both in business and in various positions in government, those that are sufficiently forward-thinking and sufficiently able to step out of their pecuniary self-interest, whether it's my next vote, my next position, or my next, whatever it might be, to be able to tackle some of these issues in the right way and take the right kind of action that you can take, whether you're in business or whether you're in politics. That would be the question. Let's find more of them and bring them in here, right?
Joe, the final word to you, I think. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about. Gail on the chat thing is talking about trust, which we haven't even touched on. We haven't talked about post-COVID industrial society. We haven't talked about so many things. But this is a taster. This is the pre-launch launch, and I'm sure it's something we'll revisit at another Radix Big Tent event, either before or certainly at Bristol in June. But Joe, your sort of final bit in the book is that business leaders play a vital role in shaping our political economy, our societies, what lives people will have the opportunity to lead. How business leaders choose to use their political impact is one of the defining issues of the 21st century. Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic. I think that the winds of change are there, and I think we're having discussions just like today. We're having discussions in this last several years, and hopefully to continue, that would have been inconceivable in the 1980s and 1990s. Vince made the point of businesses having to invest in the long term. But we've had this period of financialized capitalism, where the short-termism of the equity markets that Vince has pointed out has infected what used to be long-term business thinking. So you get Boeing happy to spend hundreds of billions buying back their shares rather than investing in making the 737 MAX safer. But I think that these things are changing. So I see very different conversations than we used to have even 10 years ago. I see a very different attitude among business leaders. I see a very different attitude among people who go to work every day. And I want to finish with this little anecdote, which to me epitomized this change that I see is happening between the era of financialized capitalism and what I see as the new emerging era of political capitalism. And I was having a discussion with somebody about the book, and he said, it's interesting what you say. He said, because when I speak to my parents and my grandparents and tell them that I've been offered this particular job, the first question they ask me is, how much are they going to pay you? But when I speak to my peers and my colleagues and people younger than me, they ask me, is that job going to be satisfying? Do you think it's actually going to be useful? Do you think it has social value? So this may be a generational thing, but I think just that little anecdote of different generations asking fundamentally different questions, to me, heralds that the wind of change is here. It'll be choppy. The wind will change from day to day. You know, we'll tack backwards and forwards. Sometimes we'll hit a storm and move backwards. It's not going to be nice, linear, and predictable. It's going to be chaotic. But I think it's unstoppable, and I'm optimistic.
Well, that's a very lovely, optimistic note on which to end. And yes, you talk about conversations, and Radix Big Tent is all about conversations, and we will continue to have many, many more of them. Gail's come up with a brilliant idea that we should move Davos to Birmingham next year, which I think everybody would heartily applaud. So thank you so much to Gail Clintworth, to Vince Cable, to Joe, obviously, whose book, The New Political Capitalism, is out now, available from Bloomsbury or from Amazon, or get in touch with us. I'm sure we can. Yes, look, Eve's just put the links up there. Thank you for everybody who joined this fascinating subject. We could have gone on for a lot longer. And of course, if it was real time, we'd all be now mingling around a glass of warm white wine and a multi-handled peanut and have conversations. But I don't know, Ben, if you want people to stay on a bit or whatever. For me, I just want to say thank you so much to the panel and to everybody who's taken part.